The content of this podcast has not been evaluated by Health Canada or the FDA. It is educational in nature and should not be taken as medical advice. Always consult a qualified medical professional to see if a diet, lifestyle change, or supplement is right for you. Any supplements mentioned are not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease. Please note that the opinions of the guests or hosts are their own and may not reflect those of Advanced Orthomolecular Research Incorporated. Welcome to Supplementing Health, a podcast presented by Advanced Orthomolecular Research. We are all about applying evidence-based and effective dietary, lifestyle, and natural health product strategies for your optimal health. In each episode, we will feature very engaging clinicians and experts from the world of functional and naturopathic medicine to help achieve our mission to empower people to live their best lives naturally. Hello, and thank you for tuning in to another episode of Supplementing Health. Today, I am joined by Dr. Dawn Wood, developer of the Inspired Performance Program, the author of Emotional Concussions, Understanding How Our Nervous System is Affected by Events and Experiences Throughout Our Life. Dr. Wood has built his career around helping people overcome stress and anxiety with cutting-edge neuroscience, and I'm very excited for us to dive into today's topic for unresolved trauma and its effects on health. So without further ado, welcome, Dr. Wood. Thank you for joining me today.
Well, thank you very much. I'm glad to be here. I love the topic that you're talking about, so I'm sure we'll have some great things to discuss.
I'm sure you will too. I've listened to some of your previous podcasts and read through some of your writings and stuff that are online, and I think it's a very interesting topic and what you've discovered here. So why don't we start by talking about what some of the types of health issues you've seen typically resulting from unresolved trauma?
In a lot of cases, one of the things that we see a lot are autoimmune issues, Crohn's, IBS, Hashimoto's, things like that. Because what I believe is happening is that when there's that unresolved trauma, that's creating an ongoing stress response. And when we're in that stress response, what happens is maintenance is minimalized. So the body is not getting the maintenance that it needs, because I always explain it this way. If you're being chased by a lion, your mind is not going to think about doing maintenance. It's in a survival state. So when people have unresolved trauma, they're constantly living in this stress response, which is not going to allow the full maintenance to get done. So those are very common kinds of things that we see, a lot of autoimmune stuff.
Okay, so how did you discover that link between trauma and autoimmune conditions?
It really came because of, well, first my wife. When I met my wife, I realized that she was living in a very traumatic household with a very angry father. And so she was living in fear all the time. And there was nothing that I could do to seem to stop that fear. So she ended up developing Hashimoto's, not till she was a little bit older. So at the time when I met her, she didn't have it. But that ended up becoming the case. So even though she was living in a much calmer environment when she lived with me, the trauma, the unresolved trauma from her childhood was continuing to loop. And that was affecting her health. So she had Hashimoto's. My daughter, when she was 14, was diagnosed with Crohn's. And so when she was 16, she disclosed to us some trauma that had happened to her between the ages of 6 and 8 that we were unaware of. And then she also developed another autoimmune disorder called idiopathic pulmonary hemosiderosis, which is where her lungs would just start to bleed. And again, that's another autoimmune issue. And only 1 in 1.2 million people had this disorder. But really what they told us is that with her Crohn's, she'd just end up with a colostomy bag. And with this pulmonary hemosiderosis, she was going to end up with, she could just bleed out. Her lungs would fill up with blood and she would choke to death on her blood. So that's what really led me to start. My wife said to me, you've got to find an answer to this because we're going to lose our daughter. And that's when I started to do the research and made the connection between this unresolved trauma between both my wife and my daughter and so many other people that I was meeting.
I'm sure that was terrifying too. Like that would add to the stress that your daughter's already experiencing, and even your wife, when you have such a frightening experience health-wise that has come out of this, I would assume.
Yeah, it really does because especially the idiopathic pulmonary hemocirrhosis, they basically said that it's a 5 year, if 5 years is basically how long people last with that. So it was almost a death sentence. And doesn't mean that everybody did, but a lot of people, I think it was 1 out of every 4 would die within 5 years. So they said just she needed to live near a hospital because if she had it again, that she would need to get to a hospital. Otherwise, her lungs would just fill up with blood and she'd choke to death. So, and then on top of that, you add in the fact that she's got the Crohn's, where they're saying, I mean, this poor child really suffered. She was constantly in the hospital. And the only answer they had for her were steroids. And the steroids were to try to bring the inflammation down because she could go down to 90 pounds because she just couldn't eat. She couldn't pass any food through. So, and then for my wife on top of that, she's obviously had her own childhood trauma, and now she's dealing with her own child that's had some health issues on top of her childhood trauma. So absolutely. So this is now just aggravating and compounding on top of what they were already dealing with.
So how severe does a trauma need to be to result in health issues?
Well, it's interesting. That's why I wrote the book Emotional Concussions, because I work with a lot of people who have had the big T kind of traumas, the Boston Marathon bombing, the Vegas shooting, veterans from war, and a lot of people haven't had all those kinds of experiences. So I wrote the book Emotional Concussions, which really refer to those bumps that we get along the way, where a teacher that said something, or a coach that was mean to you, or a parent that maybe had an alcoholic parent that was dysfunctional. Those are emotional concussions that can accumulate and build up and then have an effect on our health as well. And sometimes even with the best of intentions, those kinds of things can happen for children growing up because a child doesn't have enough life experience to understand understand what they're experiencing. So they're going to create a meaning to it, and those kind of meanings can also create emotional concussions.
Okay, that makes sense. So are there differences then between childhood trauma and trauma experienced as an adult as far as how it affects the body?
Yes, I believe in particular for children, it's even more profound because they're still developing. So when a child is experiencing a lot of trauma, their systems are still growing and developing. So I think it has an even bigger effect on childhood. There was a study done with Kaiser Permanente in the 90s talking about what they called ACEs, which are adverse childhood experiences. And they've made a direct correlation between how many ACEs you've had, and the ACEs could be obviously from a big T trauma, a sexual assault or physical assault. Those kinds of ACEs, the more they have, the more health problems they saw. And the study was done with 17,000 participants. And the study wasn't necessarily done with just lower income participants. It was actually done in a more middle affluent kind of a neighborhood. And they found a tremendous connection between ACEs from either 1, 2, 3, 4, or more ACEs to more severe health issues later on in life. And obviously, as an adult too, adults can also have traumas that will also affect their health, because I believe that what happens is when we have this unresolved trauma, it is basically compromising your immune system and compromising your neurotransmitters. That's going to make you sicker and you're going to feel bad.
And so for those like smaller ACEs or less obvious ACEs, like people will definitely think of abuse as trauma, right? But maybe something a coach said to you growing up that maybe hurt your feelings, a lot of those sorts of things we tend to forget, right? Or we don't consciously harbor, even though that we might have subconsciously harbored them. So how do you know if you are someone that could benefit from addressing these kind of traumas through counseling?
Well, what's interesting is, like you just said, you're not consciously thinking about it. So I was actually speaking at a group, and I was actually taking people through our process in a group. And I asked if anybody had any kind of events that they would like to share with the group that they may have had, more not in the big T traumas, but in the emotional concussions. And one lady came up, she says, well, I've never really had much of anything. You know, I've had a pretty good childhood. And as she started to talk, she started to share one experience that when she was 6 years old. And as she was talking, she was saying, we were in church and I started to talk, and my grandmother took out her hairbrush and hit me on the head and told me to stop talking. I was in church. And at this point now, the tears are flowing down her face. And she says, I just realized I lost my voice that day. She goes, I never speak up for myself. And that was sort of a revelation for her. It made the connection between when she stopped asserting herself. And now, was her grandmother trying to do that? Absolutely not. Right? Her grandmother was just trying to keep her quiet because it was in church. But a 6-year-old doesn't understand what just happened. So to her mind is that, to a 6-year-old's mind, is they don't want to hear me. Those can really have a major effect on you later in life. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that totally makes sense. Um, I wonder how, when you think you've don't have any of those, how you start the journey of uncovering them and addressing those issues.
Well, and that's what the book Emotional Concussions was written for. So I say what happens is they'll show up as symptoms. So for example, if you're the kind of person who procrastinates all the time, that's probably coming from one of those emotional concussions earlier in your life. I give 10 examples. Another example is if you blame everybody else, it's never your fault, right? Or you know somebody who does that. So every time something goes wrong, well, it wasn't my fault, their fault. Those are the kinds of emotional concussions that will show up. And so I describe, here are 10 kinds of things that if you see that you do, are probably coming from something like that.
Interesting. So is it ever too late then to address a trauma?
Never. The mind and body are designed to heal. That's what I've always said. So all we have to do is reset it. And what I mean by that is, if you read all the self-help books, they'll tell you to stay present, be in the moment. However, our minds don't work like that all the time because we've stored explicit details about events and experiences, and that interferes with our ability to stay present and in the moment. So what we're able to do is to get that reset so that you can stay more present, more in the moment. And that improves not only how you feel, but also how you heal.
Awesome. And so when you are working through past traumas, how can you know when a trauma has been addressed or cured, and so you no longer have to worry about that particular trauma?
Great question. Basically, here's what it boils down to. Anytime you have an emotion, your mind is actually calling for an action. It wants you to do something. So the purpose of fear is to escape a threat. The purpose of anger is to attack a threat. So when you think about something that happened to you 5 years ago and your heart starts pounding or you start to feel angry, then that means it's active. Your mind is actually calling for an action. However, there's no action possible. That's how you know when that stops. So, for example, I've worked with people who have had really serious traumas that could never talk about their trauma without shaking and crying. And now they're able to talk about it and they don't have that same emotional response.
Okay, cool. Um, and so what are some of the, or what makes Inspired Performance program that you've developed revolutionary in this area?
Well, what we're able to do, this is really cutting edge neuroscience. So we're able to take events and experiences that you've had in your life, and we're able, within a 4-hour process, be able to get your mind to start that reprocessing for you. So people who have come in from, the Boston Marathon, for example, Rebecca Gregory, within 4 hours, we had her that whole event updated for her. So she stopped having her nightmares. Um, so post-traumatic stress, terror nightmares, things that people are experiencing, anxiety, panic attacks, within a 4-hour process, we can get your mind to start updating all of that. And then when people come in and tell me I have anxiety, I have depression, I have this, I said, those are symptoms. That's not what you have. That's just your mind is responding to something. So we just have to figure out what it is that your mind is actually trying to get you to do. And then once we reboot that, basically your brain is just a giant computer. We're going to reset it. It's always funny. What do we do when our phones don't work? We power it off and power it back on, right? It's almost the same kind of thing. We just got to repower it up and get it to reprocess some of that old data.
And so the techniques that you use, do they require one-on-one coaching, or can people use them on their own time as well?
Yeah, we actually, I have two different ways. One is somebody can come and see me and I take you through the techniques one-on-one, but we also developed it digitally. So you can actually do the whole 4-hour program that you would do one-on-one with me online through a digital process. And it's the exact same program, except instead of me being there, you're just guiding yourself. I guide you through it, but you're just following along with the videos.
Okay, cool. And so if you have a health condition as a result of past traumas, can that condition be cured once the trauma is addressed then?
Yeah, we always have to be careful about saying the word cure because, cure is a powerful word. I do know that if the nervous system comes back into regulation, then you can see improvements in health because the maintenance gets done. I can tell you for a fact on my own daughter who had Crohn's, like I said, she had 4 resections done, 4 major operations to take out pieces of her intestines because they basically just atrophied. She hasn't had a Crohn's flare up after going through the program. So she is, the proof that I saw for sure. And I've heard other people say that other things have improved after they go through the program.
That's fantastic. And so I guess one of the things that we think of a lot being tied to trauma would be substance abuse. And
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that in and of itself is a health issue, but isn't always thought of as a health issue. So do you find that a lot of the people you work with have substance abuse issues and that those get addressed through your program as well?
No, actually, we do a lot with addiction because that is a very common issue. And the reason being, I treat addiction completely different. What I say to somebody is that there's nothing wrong with you and there's nothing wrong with your mind. You have had traumas and you found a resource that temporarily helped you deal with that trauma. So what drugs and alcohol are doing, in particular, if I use those as the addictions, drugs and alcohol are basically helping you feel better. So the reason people use them is that they're not trying to hurt themselves. They're not trying to damage themselves. They're really trying to feel better. So I had a lady who had come to me, she'd been on heroin, and she said, I told my therapist that I was coming to see you, and he told me that I have to be upfront and honest and let you know I have self-destructive behavior. And I said to her, I smiled, and I said, really? Why would you think you're self-destructive? Now, this surprised her because she was looking at me saying, well, I'm sticking a needle in my arm with heroin. Don't you think that's self-destructive? And I said to her, I says, no, I don't. I think you're trying to feel better. And I says, I bet you when you stuck the needle in your arm, you felt better. Now, the substance you're using is destructive. However, you're not destructive. I know why you were doing it is because you were in pain, either physical or emotional pain. And when you took the drug or you took the substance, it stopped temporarily the pain. That's why you were doing it. That has nothing to do with your character, your morals, your willpower, your ethics. That's human behavior.
That's definitely a different or a novel way of looking at it. Often I think as outsiders, if you're not someone dealing with that particular addiction or whatever it is that's at the root cause of their addiction, you do see it as destructive, right? You feel like, why are they doing this to themselves? They have so much to be living for or happy about or whatever, because you're not dealing with that mental loop probably that's going on that they're trying to escape, right?
Exactly. So what happened is because they had the pain, they found a resource. And when they used that resource, it temporarily stopped the pain. The problem was is they repeated it. And the more they repeated it, they were building a code. And the code was, this is how we stop pain. You see, your subconscious mind, your survival brain is literal. So it doesn't see things as good or bad, right or wrong. It basically says that substance stops the pain. And its goal is to keep you out of pain, to keep you out of danger, right? To keep you alive. And so that's what happened. They got stuck in a loop of, of trauma, which got them stuck in a loop of resolving the trauma, which is the drugs or alcohol. Like I said, I used to feel the same way because I've never had a drink in my life. I've never touched a drug in my life. And so I used to see it the same way, is that what's wrong with these people? Why would they do that? They've got all these things going for them. Now I understand it much differently. It's all coming from a subconscious survival brain trying to protect you from pain.
So then from the biochemical level where, some of these substances actually do impact your biochemistry and change the different levels of serotonin or dopamine or whatever it is within your body, how does that get addressed by dealing with the trauma? Because obviously the trauma is on the emotional level. I don't know if it also has an impact on that biochemical level as well, or if there's kind of two pieces to this puzzle.
Well, there actually is two pieces. So that's a great question. What happens is the emotional side obviously is going to put the system into a pause, right? Because it's not going to be doing as much maintenance. So we're going to get sicker because not as much maintenance is getting done. And then when you start taking, let's take alcohol, for example. If you are drinking alcohol, you're going to zap a lot of your B vitamins. And so if your B vitamins are depleted, you're going to start feeling bad. It's going to affect your gut. So there's all kinds of things. And, the majority, 80% of your serotonin, GABA, dopamine are produced in the gut. So if the gut is out of balance, it's not going to be producing the nutrients, not going to be producing those neurotransmitters that you need to feel better. So both that combination. So when we have somebody go through our addiction program, we also make sure that they're supplementing it with some of the vitamins and nutrients that they need that have been zapped during their addiction time.
Okay, and then so on the flip side, we don't often think of high performers as having any issues, right? Yet you have worked with athletes on their performance as well as like high-powered professionals. So how does one change patterns to help improve those kind of performances?
Same kind of thing. Again, it's one of the things that people, when you look at somebody and you say, well, they're a famous athlete and they've got money and they've got fame and they've got all these different things, they're still dealing with some of the same things that we are. They just happen to be able to perform at a fairly high level in whatever particular field they're in. But it doesn't mean they're not struggling. I think we've now started to hear a lot more about some of the professional athletes coming out talking about their anxiety, their panic attacks. The young girl who withdrew out of the French Open because she wouldn't do media. Right? She's one of the best players in the world, but she could get so anxious if she had to go and speak to the media that she had to withdraw. There's a professional basketball player that was sharing that he was having panic attacks. So you would look at it and go, what could possibly be creating that? They've got everything. They've got money. They've got fame. They've got success. But again, the brain doesn't know any of that. It's still dealing with what it's dealing with. So after we work with people, that's why, again, we call this a performance program, not trauma therapy, because I don't believe there's anything wrong with anybody. Everybody's mind works perfectly fine. However, there have been events and experiences that are interfering with your ability to stay present and in the moment. And so what I find is when I work with an executive, I had a guy just in here last week that came in, and the guy's making about $2 million a year, fairly successful by a lot of standards of what people would think, but his anxiety was going through the roof. and he was really struggling. And not only did that affect his performance in his work, even though he was still pretty good at it, it was affecting his enjoyment of life. And so once we get the nervous system regulated, there was really things that were coming in that were interfering with his ability to do that. Once we get that back regulated, he can then go back into that feeling a sense of peace. And his performance is going to go up and his enjoyment of life will go up.
Yeah, that's really cool. And I was just kind of thinking about athletes in general, the ones that do make a professional level or a higher caliber within their preferred sport. They've started at a young age, and some of them have experienced a lot of pressures in trying to get to the level that they're at. Can those kind of pressures and that kind of performance um, expectation and like learning and training and all of that play into the traumas that are building to create performance anxiety or whatever other symptoms they're experiencing?
Yes, absolutely. Another great question, because I work with, this is probably in the last month, I've worked with two athletes, one a female, one a male, that are going. One is already in college and nationally ranked in their sports. The other one is going into college, probably going to be nationally ranked as a junior, probably will be nationally ranked in college. And both of them have dealt again with loving, nurturing parents who put so much pressure on them that they actually, the guy in particular, had serious injuries, health problems. And those injuries were, I believe, coming from the fact that he was constantly under stress. So he wasn't getting the maintenance done that he needed to get done. Um, so not only were his parents in particular putting a lot of pressure, they also hired a coach that was one of these yellers and screamers, right? Made him feel bad all the time. What was interesting is that his parents realized and recognized that maybe they had put too much stress. I think because they recognized that this coach was also doing it. So the parents really did a great job on trying to modify the way they were responding and putting the pressure on him. They got rid of that coach. And the health issues that so when we were talking about it, his health had actually improved over the last 2 years. And there was a direct correlation between the time where his parents went for some counseling to help with their stress that they were putting him under, and they got rid of that coach. There's no question in my mind, there's a direct line between that.
And is there a particular age in which people should start working on their psyche and any traumas that they've experienced?
I've worked with children as young as about 7 or 8. That's about the youngest I've worked with, because before that, it's really hard for them to sort of get them to comprehend. It doesn't mean that they couldn't. We are working on trying to develop a program for younger children. So, but if I do work with a child, I would have them come to see me one-on-one as opposed to our digital program, because I think the digital would be a little harder for them to go through on their own. But
Yeah,
one-on-one, I can tailor it a little bit better for them.
fair enough.
But I'm actually working on a digital program for kids too. So, and the reason it would be a little different is the material that would sort of be the same, but it would be the presentation that I would
Right.
present it a little bit different, right? So I do it a little bit more in an entertaining fashion as opposed to a scientific kind of response.
Okay, cool. And so if listeners were interested in your program, would your website be the best place for them to start?
Yes, they can go to that, or they can go to www.gettipp. That's the name of the program, TIP. So gettipp.com, and
Okay,
that's where they're going to get the best information. So that people want to sign up for the program through your show, I think they offer a discount or something for your show.
well, I really appreciate you taking the time to chat with me today. It's such a fascinating topic that obviously can impact everyone and anyone. So it's really great to start exploring some of this cutting edge neuroscience that you've created and developed and discovered and get it out to those that need it most.
Yeah, and I enjoyed speaking with you as well.
Thank you for listening to Supplementing Health. For more information about our guests, past shows, and future topics, please visit aor.ca/podcast or aor.us/podcast. Do you have a topic you want us to cover? We invite you to engage with us on social media to request a future topic or email us at marketing@aor.ca.